Okay, so this is our lecture for week 4 from Social Evolution, and the main topic of this lecture is sex and mating. But first, before we get into the topics that we're going to cover in sex and mating, I want to cover a little bit more about game theory and show you how to analyze simple games. And so overall, this is going to be a pretty long lecture, and I'll try to go quickly to get through it. Okay, so coming back to game theory. So we talked at the end of the last lecture about complications, like what if individuals encounter each other repeatedly more than once? Well, you could get some more complicated strategies that would be mixed strategies where individuals can play more than one option. Okay, so I left a link for you to try playing a short game that was a repeated hawk-dove game against me as the computer player, and the question was, could you optimize your payoffs in this game? And this is the payoff information. So you can try that out, and this is that information represented as one of these payoff matrices. Okay, so if you look and analyze this payoff matrix and look for what's the best strategy to play overall, well, it turns out that it depends, right? So there's no ESS in this game. If we look at, like, what if your opponent's playing dove? If we look at the leftmost column, well, it would be better for you to play hawk. And if we look at the rightmost column, what if your opponent is playing hawk? Well, it would be better for you to play dove. Okay, so we've got this like dilemma. So what you should play depends on what you think your opponent is going to play. Okay, so what did you do? Well, the small number of students who tried this out, the vast majority of you played dove on your first move. So you're nice overall. And I was nice too on my first move. I also played dove. On your second move, most of you used the same strategy that you did on your first move. And in this particular iterated game, a winning strategy would have been for you to play dove first, or if you played dove first, I should say, a winning strategy would have been for you to play hawk second, because my strategy as the computer player was that I played dove first, and then if you had played dove, I would have played dove second as well. And you could have scored the highest outcome if you switched from dove to hawk. And that would optimally take advantage of the opponent's dovishness. Well, only 2 players out of the 13 who tried it actually did that. Okay, so let's look at the answers to the practice questions from the last lecture. So in this option, can you analyze this matrix and determine which, if either of these 2 strategies, would be an ESS? Well, all we have to do is break it down by these columns again. So on the leftmost column, if your opponent's playing dove, it's better for you to play hawk. And on the rightmost column, if your opponent is playing hawk, it's better for you to play hawk. So, and this is a symmetrical game. So if I analyze it by row, I get the same outcome. So no matter what the U player is doing, it's better for the opponent to play hawk. So all arrows point towards hawk here. So the correct answer out of those 3 options is that in this game, hawk is an ESS. It's better overall to play hawk. The population will evolve to be all hawks. Okay, what about this option? We've changed the playoff matrix. What happens in this scenario? Okay, so let's analyze it again. Left column, if your opponent is playing dove, it's better for you to play hawk. And in the right column, if your opponent plays hawk, it's better for you to play dove. So notice in this case, we have some negative payoffs. So that's possible as well. And that would be the case if you got something costly happening to the individual who gets the negative payoff. Okay, so it's a symmetrical game. And so we get the same outcome if we analyze it in the other dimension. What it's best for you to do depends on what the opponent's doing. So what this means is there is no ESS in this game. And so the population is going to evolve towards a mixture of doves and hawks. All right, so you need to know how to do this for the midterm and exam in this course. But what you also need to know how to do is to compute what is that mixture, what proportion of doves will there be in the population? What proportion of hawks will there be for this particular game, or some other payoff matrix that I could give you? And it's shown how to do that in the YouTube video that we saw last time, but I'm going to show you how to do it again in this lecture. So we can take any payoff matrix and we can calculate those equilibrium frequencies for a matrix where there's no ESS. And so we do that by solving a system of pretty simple equations. The tricky part is probably just making sure that you set the equations up correctly in the first place. Okay, so here's how we do it. Okay, so let's set up our notation first. So let's have little h be the proportion of hawks, and let's have big H be the expected fitness for the average hawk. And we'll use little d as the proportion of doves, and big D as the expected fitness for the average dove. And we know at equilibrium, the payoff on average to hawks must be equal to the payoff on average to doves. So we know big H must equal big D at equilibrium, and that's what we're ultimately going to solve for. We also know that for any time point, h plus little d must always equal 1. Okay, so really we can express little d in terms of little h, right? So or little h equals 1 minus little d. Okay, so now we're going to write the two equations representing the expected fitness for each strategy. And we just base those on the payoff matrix. So what we do is we go in and we look at, let's use the rows here. So the fitness for the average dove, big D, is equal to 2 times the frequency with which it will encounter doves plus 0 times the frequency with which it will encounter hawks. And so again, those two numerical coefficients come straight out of the payoff matrix, and we're just multiplying those by the expected rate at which they encounter those two phenotypes in the population. And similarly, the average fitness for a hawk will be equal to 4 times little d minus 1 times little h. Okay, so now we can go in there and express both of these in terms of little d. So we can substitute all of the little h's with 1 minus little d and simplify. And so here's my substitution, here's my simplification. So I end up getting big D equals 2 little d, and big H equals 5 little d minus 1. All right, so I've got these two equations now, both expressed in terms of little d. And now at equilibrium, I know that big H equals big D, so I can just solve those equations, solve for little d. So just reminding you what was on the previous slide. So we set big H equal to big D to solve for equilibrium. And so we've got 5 little d minus 1 equals 2 little d. And we just solve this like you would have done in high school. And you end up getting little d equals 1/3. So we can conclude that for this game at equilibrium, we'd expect the population to be 1/3 or 33.33% doves and about 2/3 or 66.67% hawks. All right, so it probably makes sense seeing that, but it's another thing to try it yourself. So what you should do is go to Brightspace, and I've added a PDF under the lecture and video section there where you can work through a few examples of these kinds of calculations, and the answers are in that file so you can check your answers as well. Okay, so now we can get into the new material on sex and mating. And I want to start with this deep sea anglerfish. So scientists, these fish live really, really deep in the ocean, so there's a lot about their biology that we don't know much about. They're hard to observe. And scientists were capturing specimens occasionally, and they noticed that all of the specimens they were capturing were females. But they also noticed that the females often had these weird lumps on their abdomens, and they look like maybe a parasite or a tumor. And this is another species of these deep sea anglerfishes. And it turned out that these weird growths on the females' sides were the males. Males of these fish species are way smaller than females. A female could be 10 kilograms, and the male could just be a couple of grams. And apparently what happens is that when a male locates a female, he bites into her skin, releases enzymes into her circulatory system that start to fuse his body with hers, including fuse her circulation with hers. So her nutrition in her blood ends up nourishing his body. He's no longer eating, he's just a lump in her side, and he undergoes a frightening change. He loses his digestive organs, he loses his brain, he loses his heart, and he ends up just a pair of testes attached to the female's body that release sperm into her bloodstream when it's time to spawn. So this is a remarkable mating system. How unusual is this? Well, it probably makes sense given the extreme ocean depths with really low population densities and poor resources and difficulty in finding another member of your own species down there. And it means that a female, whenever she's ready to spawn, has a mate immediately on hand. And a single female can even have multiple mates attached. All right, so that is an example of extreme sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism means when the sexes differ. And I mentioned at the beginning of the course that Darwin came up with a theory, sexual selection, to explain some of these patterns of phenotypic and behavioral differences between the sexes. And he realized that organisms don't just compete to survive and support their offspring, they also compete just to mate. And when you have sexual reproduction with more than one mating type, this leads to the possibility that traits that confer high mating success in one sex might be different from the kinds of traits that confer high mating success in another sex. Darwin also noticed that in some species, the males are very showy and the females are not so flashy and showy, but tend to be very particular about who they mate with. And he noticed that in other species, the males are very competitive and compete aggressively with each other. And he divided sexual selection up into two different processes that we now call intersexual selection and intrasexual selection. And intersexual selection refers to the process of mate choice. Inter means between. And I always remember that because inter has an E and between has a bunch of E's. Okay, so it refers to the process where one sex is trying to be chosen by the other sex. Intrasexual selection refers to competition for mates within a sex. And so that refers to a process where one sex is fighting with each other and not necessarily trying to be chosen by the other sex. Now, of course, both of these processes can happen simultaneously in many different species. But starting with Darwin, thinkers in sexual selection divided them up into two separate processes. Okay, so Darwin noticed that females often choose and males often compete, but why? Why is that the case in a lot of animal species? It's not the case in every species, but it is apparently common. Well, the theoretical basis for this came decades after Darwin, and in the 1940s, the geneticist A.J. Bateman hypothesized that male reproductive success increases with the number of mates a male has, whereas female reproductive success does not. And he verified this with an empirical test in the 1940s by putting fruit flies into vials where he would control the number of potential mates in a vial. So you might put like one female with a few males or one female with just one male. And so he had many replicates in this experiment, and he measured on average how successful were males and how successful were females at producing offspring, and how did their success depend on the number of mates they had. Well, what he found was that there was this steep linear increase in the number of offspring males could produce if they had more females to mate with. However, in females, he found this plateau where female mating success was, of course, zero when they had zero mates, but it seemed to plateau after one mate. Having two males or three males didn't seem to create any further improvements for a female, at least in this species in his experiment. And so he argued that this verified his general hypothesis here. Okay, so there's a higher potential reproductive rate for males than there is for females. Okay, so we call this Bateman's principle. And it actually has a lot of recent challenges that we're not going to get into, but that could be an interesting project for one of you. So why does this happen? Well, the theory was that it all comes back to the gametes, the sex cells. And anisogamy just means different gametes. So it's when the sexes have different gametes, which is like the definition of there being sexes. But male gametes are small and numerous, whereas female gametes, eggs, are relatively fewer and larger. Not universally true, but often true. Okay, so because of this difference in gametes, males can make more gametes. There's just more out there. There's more sperm out there than there are eggs, which means that all of the sperm have more competitors to be able to successfully fertilize another gamete. And so that difference between the gametes sets up the possibility for this imbalance. So a large number of sperm are competing to fertilize a small number of eggs. So that means that some males are going to be winners and some are going to be losers. And so there's more variation in reproductive success in males. And it also means that the most successful males are more successful than the average female. So for the best males, the greatest fitness advantage comes from competing for as many matings as possible rather than investing in parental care. However, that's not the case for the females. They're limited by their gametes, or they can be limited in other ways too, but just at the most fundamental level, they might be limited by their gametes. And so they don't get an advantage by competing for increasing numbers of mates. And so for females, the fitness advantage instead comes from investing in parental care. Well, this means that females that are engaged in parental care are not available for mating. And so this limits the availability of females and female gametes even more. And this creates a situation called a male-biased OSR, or operational sex ratio. It's the ratio of males to females available for mating. And so this whole causal pathway is the classical model for why males compete for mates and why females are choosy. And here's a graphical example of what happens. If some of the females in the population are taken out of the pool of available mates because they're caring for offspring, it means that the population has an even more male-biased OSR. And so it just kind of ratchets up that process of differing selection on males and females and creates positive feedback. Okay, so again, this is the theoretical logic for the reason that sexual selection tends to produce competitive males and choosy females. However, it's not always the case. And some people have argued that the classical model has been overblown and maybe influenced by our own human biases about kind of sexual morality. There are species with sex role reversal, so females are not always choosy. What's interesting, though, is that these examples of sexual reversal follow the evolutionary logic. Even though males can be the choosy sex, it makes sense. It kind of follows the same reasoning. It's because in these systems, the males have become the limiting resource. Okay, so in some species, males provide parental care. So like in seahorses, where the males are pregnant, so the males are being taken out of the population when they're doing care. And in those systems, the males will be very choosy about who they mate with, and females will be very competitive. And in those systems, you have female-biased operational sex ratios. In another example, Mormon crickets, the males provide this really nutritious nuptial gift, and you can see it in that image there. The males produce something called a spermatophore. It's a package that it has sperm, but it's also packed with nutrition. So the female will eat it, and she gets fertilized, and she gets a big meal that she uses to produce large, well-nourished offspring. So in the Mormon cricket, the spermatophores males produce are hugely exaggerated. They're about a quarter of the male's whole body mass. They often only produce one of these spermatophores in their entire lifetime. And so what that's doing is it's totally changing that premise of male gametes being numerous and easy to produce, right? The male is only producing one of these things per lifetime, one chance of him getting successful mating. And so what happens is males are very choosy in the Mormon cricket about who they mate with. Okay, in some species, both sexes can be choosy, and we call this mutual mate choice, and it often occurs in species where both sexes invest heavily in parental care. For example, in the crested auklets, which is a seabird that breeds in the Arctic, both of the sexes care for the offspring, and they look alike, and they both have these funky little curly crests that they grow in the breeding season. And some researchers from Memorial University did experiments where they presented auklets with models of the opposite sex that had alterations of their crest ornament, and they showed that both males and females preferred to perform their courtship displays for the models that had the longer, bigger, elaborate crests. So they're both choosy. Okay, choosiness can also vary within a species depending on the environment. So in this particular group of katydids, Choanophila, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. They live in Australia, these katydids. They're like, katydids are related to crickets. And the males produce spermatophores. But in this system, their food supply of these Choanophila katydids varies a lot over the breeding season. They feed on these flowers that produce not very much pollen at the beginning of the season, but later in the season, there's like rich, abundant pollen to feed on. And in this small photograph, you can see one of these katydids feeding on one of these flowers. Okay, so they were studied by Daryl Gwynn at the University of Toronto, and he showed that when their food supply is limited early in the season, the males are choosy. And it's probably because it's difficult for them to produce a spermatophore when resources are poor. And he also showed, and what's shown in this table, is that when the food is scarce, the females fight with each other much more. There's greater competition among the females, greater aggression. Later on in the season, when food is abundant, the males are able to produce more spermatophores. They start to advertise, they start calling to attract females, and they're no longer choosy. But now the females are limited by their own speed of producing eggs. And so what happens is the females become choosier later in the season and reject some males and no longer fight with each other. Okay, so moving on, I want to give you a few examples of those two different processes of sexual selection, intra and inter. And I'm going to illustrate them through examples for two different time frames for each one. So this slide just lays out the definitions, and which I already mentioned, the difference between intersexual selection and intra. But I want to highlight in the next few slides how both of these processes can take place both before and after mating. So pre-copulatory means before mating, post-copulatory means after. And so I'm going to show you a few examples with a couple of short videos. All right, so this first one starts with a video of some of these elephant seals, these male elephant seals competing for their mates. Okay, so this is intrasexual selection taken to its extreme. And this is pre-copulatory. These males have not mated yet. They're competing over a little patch of beach where females are later going to come, and whichever male owns that beach territory, he's going to get to mate with all the females who show up to that little stretch of beach. So this is pre-copulatory competition within a sex. There's other ways that intrasexual selection before copulation can play out. There's examples include when one sex guards their mate from other individuals coming in to mate with them. Also interference. Sometimes one sex will prevent their competitors from mating, usually through like aggression as well. And in the elephant seal, it pays to be dominant. So dominant males, the biggest males who can fight off the most competitors, have a huge reproductive advantage. And so this bar graph shows you data on a bunch of different males and the relationship between their dominance rank. So being ranked 1 means that those were males that could defeat the other males in the population. So the number 1 ranked male they were on average getting like almost 40 copulations, whereas the males ranked as low as 9 and 10 were lucky if they got 1 copulation. Okay, and it's thought that this extreme competition, this extreme intrasexual selection, has led to extreme sexual dimorphism in this species. And so the little tiny picture on the upper right of the slide is showing you a male with a female. The females weigh about 1,500 pounds, the males weigh about 5,000 pounds. And so to look at this question of whether competition among males has generated variation across species in sexual dimorphism and body size, researchers collected data for a number of different seal and walrus species, and that's what I'm going to show you in this graph. So on the x-axis, we have a metric that is the ratio of male body size to female. So the larger the value is along the x-axis, it means the more exaggerated males are compared to females. And on the y-axis, we have a metric of how many mates a dominant male can obtain on average. So in a species like the elephant seal, they'll like the dominant male will be monopolizing 40 females, whereas in some other seal or walrus species, the dominant male might only be able to obtain like 2 or 3. Okay, so they collected those data for a whole bunch of different seal and walrus species, and here's what the relationship looks like. So we see this positive correlation. The species that have the greater size differences between the sexes also tend to be the species where the dominant male, is able to monopolize a larger number of mates. Now, this is just a correlation, and we're looking at evolution. So it's interesting which, whether the researchers chose to put the body size difference or the mate monopolization on the X or Y axes, because we don't know if it was like the evolution of mate monopolization that led to the body size evolution, because it could have been the other way around. Maybe the evolution of greater body size dimorphism led to the evolution of greater mate monopolization. And it's possible that both of those two traits kind of feed back on each other, that they mutually can cause each other. So, okay, so what about post-copulatory? So can males compete, or can females compete with each other after mating? Well, I don't know if females can compete with each other after mating. I have to think about that. But we do have a lot of examples of males competing intrasexually after copulation, and that happens through sperm competition. And this happens inside the female reproductive tract. So many different species, like including mammals, arthropods, including insects, and even primates, the females can mate with more than one male, And the males have often involved special structures on their genitalia that help them remove the sperm from previous mates, for example, or that leave a plug behind in the female. So after a male mates with a female, he'll leave like a secretion that hardens and prevents that female from mating with another male. So these are examples of warfare, of competition happening in this post-copulatory intersexual selection manner. Okay, what about intersexual selection? The most beautiful kind. Let's look at another short video here. This is a clip that shows you a really interesting pheasant species and a tragopan.
This is Bulwer's pheasant, and he has got spectacular wattles. He's impressive enough when he's going about his normal business, but when she is around, he gets very excited indeed. Impressive though he is, she is very critical. He's not good enough, it seems. Another pheasant, Temminck's tragopan. His costume jewellery is even more elaborate. And if you've got it, why not flaunt it?
Okay, so these are examples, these courtship displays are examples of courtship that has evolved through intersexual selection pre-copulatory, right? So these are behaviors, traits that function before mating to encourage females to choose these particular males as their mate. So we've covered that before, but intersexual selection can also happen after mating, and that's perhaps more surprising. We can have post-copulatory intersexual selection. So what we're saying is mate choice can go on after mating. And I'm going to show you another video of a bird. This is a dunnock, which is a small European bird that's common in people's backyards. And this video will show you something that they do. So what you're going to see in this clip is a male and a female, and the male is inspecting the female's genitals, her cloaca, and pecking at her. Okay, so these dunnocks are incredibly promiscuous. Both the females and the males will mate with more than one individual of the opposite sex. And so that female had almost certainly mated with a different male not too long before this happened. And what researchers found in the 1980s is that the cloaca pecking behavior, when the male pecks the female's cloaca, it can cause her to sometimes eject sperm from a previous mating. And the male most often does this behavior when there's a good chance that his partner has recently mated with someone else, for example, because another male has been around, or maybe because the male who's doing the cloaca pecking doesn't know where his social partner was recently. So the whole point is mate choice can also go on after copulation, because females are able to control what happens to whether fertilization occurs, even if they've already mated. So, and it's not just dunnocks, other species have cryptic female choice as well. For example, this is the red jungle fowl, which is an ancestor of the chicken. And the jungle fowl have these strong dominance hierarchies where, like, a single male, the dominant male might have a group of females that will be his mates. And in the early 2000s, researchers were studying this species in a captive population and observing the copulations, and they found that females were much more likely to retain the sperm, so they were less likely to eject it when they were mated to the most dominant male. And so that's what this graph is showing. There's like male dominance rank on the x-axis, and then the probability of a female ejecting sperm on the y. So most of the sperm ejections happened when a female had mated with a subordinate male. So females can bias their sperm retention. They can be choosy about who fertilizes their eggs even after they've mated. Okay, cryptic female choice can lead to some really interesting morphological evolution. This example comes from ducks, like these mallards that you see in the lower part of the slide, and ducks have a lot of forced copulation. And also, most birds don't have penises, but ducks have evolved some very elaborate penises. They can have penises that are 20 centimeters long with spirals and spikes, and the females have really elaborate reproductive tracts that often have spirals in the opposite direction than the male penis goes, and the female reproductive tracts will have all these like dead ends and blind pouches. And what you're seeing at the top of the image there is an ACBD. Those are examples of a bunch of different duck species showing and the lower part is like the male penis, and the upper part is like the female reproductive tract. Okay, so could this kind of arms race over fertilization and post-copulatory choice, could that have led to the elaboration, the kind of different directions that evolution has taken these different duck genital morphologies? Well, to look at that question, researchers measured these traits from a bunch of different waterfowl species, and that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing the data from these ducks, and on the x-axis they've measured the length of the penis of the male duck, and on the y-axis you've got two different graphs. The top one shows the number of pouches that the female reproductive tract has, and the lower graph shows how many spirals the female reproductive tract has. And so again, these are these correlations across species, and what we see is that in the species that have the longer penises, the female reproductive tract is correspondingly more complex. So it is consistent with this hypothesis that there's this co-evolutionary arms race where, like, the males evolve a longer penis and then the female evolves a longer, more complex reproductive tract, possibly to try to control fertilization. Okay, so far we've described the first two items on this outline. So we've talked about the direction of sexual selection, and we've looked at some examples of how this can occur, intra and inter and pre and post-copulatory. What we're not going to cover today, and it's a huge area of sexual selection, is why be choosy in the first place? What are the benefits of being choosy about your mate? And this is a fascinating topic. It's one that has been a major question since Darwin came up with the theory of sexual selection. And the idea that females might benefit from being promiscuous is one that was ignored for a long time, again, because of our own human social biases. And so I'm not going to cover it, even though it's such a huge topic, but I want to highlight it as a potential area that some of you might want to cover for your projects at the end of the course. Instead, I wanted to go into some of these other topics because it's such a big topic. I could easily spend multiple lectures talking about this stuff. So let's talk now about how animals choose. So we're talking about proximate mechanisms of mate choice. And in particular, I want to highlight some ways that perception and cognition can come into play and how that might influence the ultimate evolutionary processes. So these proximate mechanisms can shape evolution. Okay, so the first example I want to give you is that social learning is often involved. In many species, females tend to choose the same male that other females are choosing. And it's been shown experimentally in animals where just the presence of a female, like you could put, let's say, like a stuffed peahen out on a lek near a certain male, and that you'll experimentally create more attention for that male from other females in the population. That's been done with a few bird species, for example. Well, I wanted to show you some data from humans. You probably won't be surprised to find out that this might happen in humans as well. Researchers looked at this using an eye tracking study in the lab, and they had heterosexual subjects come in and view photographs of an opposite sex person with a partner shown in the photograph, and they varied the attractiveness of the partner, and they used an eye tracking device to record the gaze pattern of the subject, and then they assessed afterwards how attractive the subject thought the potential opposite sex partner was. Okay, so these are the results for the study, and what they found was that both men and women were more interested in the potential mate when that potential mate was paired with a more attractive partner. Okay, so another important point when we're talking about how animals choose their mates is that it's very common for animals to use multiple cues to choose their mates. It's not always about one trait, right? It's very often like they're assessing several different aspects like song, color, dance. And in studies of house finches, the male's red plumage is a very important trait that females choose on, and the males vary a lot in how red they are. The bigger image on the slide shows a male on the left and a female on the right, but males can be really, really red, but they can also be quite dull and yellow, and females tend to prefer the reddest mates in house finch populations. But interestingly, it's not all about color alone. Females in house finches also choose based on genetic compatibility. Females prefer distantly related males who are more genetically dissimilar from themselves. And an ultimate explanation for this proximate mechanism, this genetic preference, is that the preference helps females avoid inbreeding. So it's expected that by mating with a distantly related mate, those two genomes, as they combine to produce the offspring, those different genomes will probably function better together and be less likely to have sort of multiple copies of the same deleterious mutation. Okay, so why do I think this is important to bring up? Well, the compatibility example shows you that mate choice is not always directional. It's not always about like choosing the bigger, the louder, the strongest this or that. Often choice can be based on compatibility, and the best mate in one individual's eyes might not be the best mate for another. Okay, so the next area I want to talk about under this category of proximate mechanisms has to do with perceptual effects. And this is something that we don't know a lot about yet, but it's really exciting. I find it such an interesting area of research. So there are a lot of features of how perception works that have been well studied in psychology, and we're only now starting to learn how those effects are coming to play in social evolution. And so here's the first example I want to show you about these kind of perceptual rules. Weber's law is like a broad feature of how perception works in humans and in animals, and it's just a feature of like how neurons detect things. But Weber's law states that as the magnitude of two stimuli increases, we need a bigger difference to distinguish them. So another way of saying that is our minds, our perceptual systems detect relative differences, not absolute differences. And I'm going to show you an example on this slide. So I'm going to show you some pairs of bars. And so we've got bar A and B here. So which of these two bars is longer, A or B? Well, I'm guessing you can tell that B is a little bit longer than A. But what about this example? Is A or B longer? It's a lot harder to tell. But the difference, the absolute difference between A and B on the left is exactly the same as the absolute difference between A and B on the right. But as the bars get longer overall, we get a lot worse at being able to judge. And it becomes even worse when the bars get really long. So again, which is bigger, A or B? Well, the difference between them is exactly the same as it was in the first example I showed. It's a 10 pixel difference in each case, but you can really only tell, you can only judge a 10 pixel difference when the overall size of the bars is small. So the law, the principle again, is that our perceptual systems judge relative differences, not absolute differences. Okay, so why does this matter in mate choice? Well, we expect that animal perceptual systems work this way too. We expect that mate choice should be based on relative differences, not absolute differences. So let's say females are choosing based on how long a male's tail is. Well, in this little cartoon on the lower part of the slide, it should be relatively easy for the female to tell the difference between the two males on the left, one that has kind of a medium length tail and one that has a very short stumpy tail. But as the males' tails get longer and longer, and as perhaps evolution exaggerates the length of those tails, it becomes harder for the female to tell the difference based on, just a centimeter or two. So as ornaments evolve to get more extreme, it takes a bigger and bigger difference to impress a female. And so that might explain why sexual selection runs up against a limit, right? Like, why is the peacock's tail not even bigger than it is right now? Well, one of the reasons is probably that females can't tell the difference, but a 1 centimeter difference becomes imperceptible when the tail is so big. Well, there's some actual data on this happening, and it comes from a frog, the Tungara frog, that live in Central America. And so this is a short video clip of male Tungara frogs calling and trying to attract mates. Okay, so the Tungara frogs have this call known as the whine chuck, and they always give a whine, and the number of chucks they give at the end of the whine is variable. Sometimes they give no chucks, but sometimes they can produce up to 7 chucks after the whine. And it turns out that females prefer the males that give the most number of chucks. For whatever reason, females like these chucks. Okay, so to test whether Weber's law and these perceptual effects might influence females' ability to discriminate these calls, the researchers studied, they brought these frogs into the lab and they presented them with calls from 2 speakers so they could carefully control the features of these calls and present females with the sensation that there's 2 calling males at either sides of this arena that differ in the number of chucks that they're giving and which of these 2 males is the female going to approach. So it's this really beautiful system for experimentally testing how mate choice works. And so on the lower part of this slide, on the left side, you're seeing kind of a schematic for 2 of the treatments in this experiment. So the female was in the top would have been choosing between a call with 2 chucks or a call with 4 chucks. And in the lower part, she'd be choosing between a call with 5 chucks or a call with 7 chucks. And the data in this graph are showing you the aggregate results from doing many, many, many of these types of experiments. And on the x-axis, we're seeing the ratio or the relative difference in chucks for the options that females were choosing. And so what they found was that that female choice was related to this ratio, and that females were able to, for example, in the top case, they would strongly choose the speaker that was playing 4 chucks, whereas in the bottom case, when both of the speakers had more chucks, but the absolute difference was still 2, they could no longer discriminate the difference. Okay, so the last perceptual effect that I want to tell you about is just a really neat example from an animal that creates this architecture. So imagine hiking through the forest and coming upon this thing. It's like, a couple of meters in size. It might be pretty creepy if you didn't know that it was produced by a bird. So this is the bower of the great bowerbird in Australia. And so they build these avenue bowers out of sticks, and they paint them with saliva, and they're quite carefully constructed. And then they carpet the area around their bower with small stones and shells and bones. And they, for whatever reason, great bowerbirds also like red and green objects. So females will visit these bowers and inspect the male. The male will do a little dance, present some fruit to her, and the female will then decide, is she going to mate with him or move on? Okay, so the perceptual effect that I want to tell you about is, these are more examples of bowers and a close-up of some of the male's objects. The neat effect here is that the males in the great bowerbird, they arrange the stones in their kind of patio or floor of their bower. They arrange the stones in a size gradient. They put the smallest stones close to the bower, and they put the largest stones farthest away. And this was shown a couple of years ago by a group of researchers led by Laura Kelly. And so the photograph on the left shows you what the typical bower looks like when the males are creating this size-based arrangement of the stones. And the example on the right is one where the researchers undid what the male had done and kind of scrambled the size-based ordering of the stones. And it gives you quite a different sense of space. And so what the males are doing is that they're creating this size gradient that gives females the optical illusion of greater depth. It's really quite remarkable. And when the researchers scrambled this ordering of the stones, they found that the males would quickly return it back to the way it should have been. And they didn't necessarily put the stones in the exact same place they had been, but they restored the size-based gradient. And so this is incredible. This is like a trick that artists use, that people didn't figure out until the Renaissance, how to mess with perspective in art. But it means that birds have been doing this for millions of years to court females. And it's probably something that makes the bower or the male look bigger than he really is. Okay, what about us? There's a lot of variation across human history and human cultures in the way people attract and court mates. And on Friday, I should say, we're going to talk about a paper that talks about variation in mating behavior even within a single human culture. But I just wanted to show you this slide because I really like this idea. The birds on the slide are a species of bird of paradise that lives in Papua New Guinea. And these are 2 males on a lek displaying their elaborate plumage, and the females look totally different, like very plain compared to these males. But what you're seeing, the person on this slide is someone from the Huli people in Papua New Guinea. And in this culture, the men show their status by collecting these hard-to-find feathers from these male birds of paradise, and they create these headdresses out of these feathers. And so they're ornamenting themselves with the sexually selected ornament of another species. So they're like co-opting the attractive traits that have evolved in these birds of paradise to try to attract mates of their own. Okay, so we're on to the last section of this lecture, and I want to comment a little bit about diversity in mating behavior, diversity in mating systems. So far, we've taken a pretty binary view of sex and mating. But I want to highlight that there are many animal groups, most of them invertebrates, that do not have separate sexes. And there are species that undergo reproduction where either partner can act as both male and female. Also, most plants can act as either male or female, and flowering plants and also some animal species can fertilize themselves. Asexual reproduction, which means reproducing clonally, is found in plants and also some animals, including some fish, reptiles, insects, and rotifers. So there really is a diverse spectrum of mating systems and ways of reproducing. And so this is one of these examples of an animal, the marine flatworm, an animal where a single individual has both male and female reproductive structures. And it's really well worth checking out a video of these animals. The photograph you're seeing here is two individuals engaging in a competition, a battle to fertilize each other. They both want to be the fertilizer and neither one wants to get fertilized. And this is really remarkable. It might be a glimpse into the kinds of social interactions in simple animals that were the ancestors of all vertebrates. I also want to highlight that there are a lot of vertebrates that can change their sex. Fish are the sex-switching masters of the animal kingdom. About 2% of fish display some kind of hermaphrodism. Some fish species, like these Kobudai, can change. They usually change from female to male. Others, like the clownfish that you know from Finding Nemo, they do the opposite. They change from male to female. And some species of fish can switch back and forth depending on the circumstance. And almost all fish species have the capacity to change their sex at the embryonic stage, depending on factors in the environment, like the acidity of the water, temperature of the water, or the presence of certain pollutants. So it's a really interesting question. Why do fish have such flexible sex determination systems? And why are like mammals so much more fixed? I don't know the answer, but that's like an open, interesting area of research. I also want to highlight that a lot of animals engage in same-sex sexual behavior. It's been recorded in over 1,500 animal species. It probably occurs in every animal species. And for a long time, evolutionary biologists took kind of a classical Darwinian view of asking, why has same-sex sexual behavior evolved if it presumably has costs? But this was a really vertebrate and mammal-centric way to look at this question. And there's this really fascinating new paper highlighted here that points out that same-sex sexual behavior is the ancestral state in animals. And different sex sexual behavior is the derived trait. That's the thing that's evolved more recently. So we really need to flip that question on its head. And these are just some examples of some of the animal groups that engage frequently in same-sex sexual behavior. And some more here. In some cases, there are known adaptive benefits to same-sex sexual interactions. For example, in the Laysan albatross, these are remarkably long-lived seabirds that can live 50 to 100 years, and they form permanent social partnerships with a mate. And they reproduce very slowly. They produce only one chick per year, and survival of these chicks is very low. Okay, so in this species, males and females look identical. To know whether an albatross is male or female, you have to take a blood sample and like get the genotype of the male. They're that similar. And so what looked like a lot of pairs, in a colony of mated pairs, researchers for a long time just assumed that all the pairs were one male and one female. But when they went and genotyped these animals, what they found was that a third of the pairs were actually two females. And this included female-female pairs raising chicks. And what they found was that the population was female biased. There were far more females in the population than males. And the females that were pairing with other females what was happening was that a male from some other pair would fertilize one of those two females, and the two females that were paired would raise that chick. And when you looked at that pair again the next year, they'd be paired again, and the other female would be the one who had been fertilized, and they'd be raising the other female's chick. And so they were taking turns, and both females in a pair had the opportunity to reproduce. The data that you're seeing here is looking at metrics of like success of their offspring, survival of their offspring, and the black bars are the male-female pairs, and the white bars are the female-female pairs. So the female-female pairs had lower hatching success than the male-female pairs, but they had good success at fledging offspring given that an egg hatched. And so overall, pairing with another female, it might produce fewer offspring than pairing with a male, but it's far better than not breeding at all. And so these results demonstrate how changes in the sex ratio of a population can really influence the social behavior and social system. Okay, so I want to end with a topic that brings us full circle and comes back to game theory. And I'm going to start with this short video of a species of fish that lives in the lakes around eastern Ontario. This is the bluegill sunfish.
A male bluegill sunfish swimming in a lake in North America seems big, strong, and confident enough to take on any rivals. He's 8 years old, and he too is ready to breed. He hollows out a shallow nest by fanning his tail. Then he sets about persuading one of the females in the shoals swimming nearby to come down and join him. He's offering both a nest and his parental services. One arrives. Although she's considerably smaller than he is, she is full grown, and he chivies her into his nest to lay. She catches his mood from his distended fins and circling dance. Things are going well. But lurking in the weeds is a tiny 2-year-old male. He will never build a nest or woo a female, but he's a serious rival nonetheless. As soon as the female lays, he darts in and delivers a jet of sperm. Back he comes and adds another squirt before he's finally chased off. The owner of the nest continues his dance. The more eggs that are laid in it, the better. The little sneak retires to the weeds. Now the big male seems to have been joined by a second female. Not so. The new one, in the middle, is an older sneaking male who dances so like a female that the big male doesn't notice the difference. The nest owner continues to chase away other males, leaving the female impersonator with the real female unhurriedly fertilizing her eggs. Eventually, the big male is left in sole charge of the nursery. He labors away, fanning the eggs to keep a current of oxygen-rich water flowing over them. And he's a devoted father, steadfastly standing guard over the fry when they hatch. 2/3 of them are probably not his.
Okay. So in Ontario, this is where it was discovered that bluegill sunfish had these alternative mating tactics that males could take on. There are 3 male phenotypes. There are these parental males, these sneaker males, and then these female mimic males. So it's discovered here in Ontario how this works, and it turns out that it might be a partly genetically determined which strategy a given male has, but it's quite complex, and we don't know all of the details yet. But it's partly genetic and partly a developmental pathway, because some males can develop into the young sneaker males then become a female mimic male when they get older. Okay, so up until now we've been talking about usually directional selection on a particular type of mating behavior or particular trait. But game theory tells us that that's not always the case in social evolution. Sometimes the best thing for you to do depends on what other individuals in the population are doing. And so it's really incredible to me that these mating systems with alternative strategies are surprisingly common. And very often they have 3 strategies. And so it's probably the case that there are a lot of opportunities for negative frequency dependent selection during mating. And so there are 2 different broad classes of alternative reproductive strategy systems. The first one we're going to call a conditional strategy system. And that's where a single individual could take on one phenotype or the other. It's like individuals can adopt a different strategy depending on the environment. Okay, so one example of that is in scorpion flies, where males can do any of several different things. They can either defend a dead insect and try to hope females will come and be attracted to that food source, or they can produce a pile of saliva and defend that, which females are apparently also attracted to, although it's not as nutritious as a dead insect. Or they can try to sneak up on a female and force copulations. Okay, and so I won't get into the details, but what researchers found was that a single scorpion fly could take on any one of these different strategies depending on what else was going on in his environment. So this is a conditional strategy, or these different strategies that the males can have are conditional strategies. Another example of conditional strategies is found in horseshoe crabs. So females of this species come to the shore to lay eggs, and the males during the breeding season patrol the shallow water and wait for females and then latch onto them to fertilize the female's eggs. When a male is latched onto a female, often other males will come on and kind of latch onto the side, and these other males are called these satellite males. So satellite males are relatively unlikely to fertilize very many of the female eggs. So why don't the satellite males just go and find their own female? Well, for one thing, the satellite males tend to be small, and so they may be unlikely to secure a female on their own because a bigger male might come by and displace them. And a researcher, Jane Brockman, studied the kinds of behaviors involved in this system, and what she determined was that yes, indeed, the satellite males tended to be smaller and they tended to be in poor condition. They tended to have more parasites. She also constructed a theoretical model of the relationship between male condition and mating success based on a lot of her observations and her measurements in the population. And her model predicts that as a male's condition gets worse, there will be a switch point where once his condition gets poor enough, he's better off playing the satellite strategy than he is playing the kind of attached male strategy. Okay, so this is called in social evolution, this kind of a situation is called the best of a bad job. So it's not universally good to be a satellite, but in some conditions, it's like the best you can do. Okay, so that was conditional strategies. We also have distinct strategy systems, which are also called pure strategies. And these are strategies where the different types, the different phenotypes are genetically based and heritable. One individual can't switch what strategy they're playing. It's in their genes. An example of a system that has this would be these isopods, these marine isopods shown at the bottom left of the slide. They live inside sea sponges, and they kind of look like the pill bugs or potato bugs that you find like in your garden or in your basement, but they live in the sea. And the females look alike, but the 3 individuals you're seeing there are the 3 different male phenotypes in this particular isopod species. They're called alpha males, beta males, and gamma males. And the alpha males are the big ones with the big horns, and they are aggressive and try to exclude other males from their sponge cavities. And they'll fight and fight and fight, whereas the tiny gamma males are able to evade the alphas and sneak matings. Okay, so researchers found that these different phenotypes are heritable, they're genetic, and they found what's shown in that table is that on average, the different strategies are able to obtain about the same number of mates. So they seem to have equal benefits at the kind of current levels at which they exist in the population. So that's consistent with a game a game theoretic game at equilibrium. Okay, another really fascinating example of a game with these multiple mating types is found in a bird, a shorebird called the ruff. It lives in wetlands of Europe and Asia. And during most of the year, both males and females look like the kind of plain looking birds at the bottom left of the slide. But during the mating season, the males grow these elaborate plumes around their head and neck that are called ruffs. And the males come in different color types, and the color types are associated with their behaviors. The territorial males are defended territory, are very aggressive to other males, and then satellite males are like join up with a territory holder and display with them. And researchers found many years ago that these two phenotypes, territorial males and satellite males, are genetic and heritable. What's really remarkable was there's actually a third type of male, and it wasn't discovered until like the 2000s, even though people had been studying these birds for a long time. There's a third type of male that looks just like a female, and you wouldn't know it was a male unless you like tested it genetically. Or if you dissected it and found that it has testes. Okay, so these males that look like females it's also a genetically based strategy. And so the population is maintaining these three strategies. So it looks like another example of like a rock, paper, scissors game at equilibrium. Okay, so just to sum up, distinct strategies are based on heritable differences, whereas conditional strategies are where an individual can play either strategy depending on his or her environment. And what's really cool about this is that there's so many systems where you have these three types. We've got the bluegill sunfish, we've got the ruffs, the isopods, we've got the Gouldian finches shown here, where we've got these three different like heritable color morphs that are associated with behavioral differences. And then we've got the side-blotched lizards that we saw in the last lecture as well. So is there something about the competition for mates that's like much like a game of rock, paper, scissors? I don't know. But of course, all of these real systems are not quite so simple as the rock, paper, scissors model. But the point is that very often in mating, your success depends on the frequency of other strategies in the population. Okay, so we looked at the side-blotched lizards last week. And I just wanted to mention, because somebody was asking about it on Friday, the details of this system. This is one that's not the maintenance of these three strategies is probably not based on mate choice. It's really based on the aggressive competition, the intra-sexual competition among the males. And the reason we know that is that researchers did some mate choice trials, and they used the kind of apparatus shown in the top of the slide, where a female was in the big chamber and they put like a male of each color morph in the three small chambers, and they tested which of the three males would the females prefer. And the females almost always prefer the yellow phenotype males. So females seem to go for the yellow type. And yet in the population, we've got these three phenotypes being maintained. And it's happening through, and they've studied like the dynamics of the proportions of these strategies over time, and how like when the blue strategy increases, while the following year, what happens is the strategy that beats blue then increases, and so on. So it really does fit the expectations of a rock, paper, scissors model. And the game is based on like males competing intrasexually. Okay, and then one last thing I wanted to bring up, again, following up on a question from last Friday. Another way that multiple pure strategies can be maintained is if the choosy sex prefers the rare phenotype. So if we had this rare mate advantage, this would generate negative frequency dependent selection. And this has been a hypothesis for a long time, but there's actually really little evidence that it goes on. The best evidence we have comes from guppies. So guppies live in these freshwater streams, and these are all photographs of males from the same population. They come in a remarkable diversity of color phenotypes. And so some of them have lots of orange, some of them have little orange, some of them have big spots, some of them have little spots. They vary in a lot of dimensions of coloration. So what the researchers did in this study was they created these different populations where they experimentally controlled what was the common phenotype for males and what were the rare ones. And so they created these situations where, like, let's say, like, most males had lots of orange, but there was a rare male who had relatively little orange. And then they'd also create a population where most males had little orange, but then there was a rare male with lots of orange. And so the question was, would females prefer the rare phenotype, whatever the rare phenotype happened to be? And what they found was that, yes, they did. So for whatever reason, the female guppies were more likely to mate with whatever was the rare phenotype in a given experimental population. So this tells us that frequency-dependent mate choice, negative frequency-dependent mate choice, might be one of the mechanisms that's maintaining the remarkable diversity of male colors in this species. All right, so that's the end for this lecture. Just a quick reminder, we've got our next discussion this Friday. We've got a paper to read by two authors that's on sex ratios and sexual behavior in humans. So come to Zoom on Friday morning for our third assignment. I hope to see you there. Bye-bye.